It happened fast, too fast for most to even notice. Over 2 billion XRP vanished in just 48 hours. No major headlines, no panic, no explanation from Ripple. Just gone. And for those paying attention to blockchain data, this isn't just another transfer between wallets. It's a sign that something big is shifting beneath the surface of the XRP ecosystem. Welcome back to Crypto Equation, where we separate speculation from structure and uncover what's really happening behind the scenes of global finance. Because today, we're diving deep into what could be one of the most significant XRP movements of the year, and what it means for investors, institutions, and the future price of XRP. The first question everyone's asking: how does 2 billion XRP just vanish? The answer lies in how the XRP Ledger works, and how its architecture allows for transparent, verifiable movements that still leave room for mystery. Every transaction on the ledger is visible, but not every motive is clear. When tokens move in massive quantities, billions at a time, they're almost always coming from institutional sources, exchanges, custodians, or Ripple-related escrow wallets. And that's exactly what happened here. Over 2 billion XRP left known wallet clusters associated with top-tier exchanges, including Binance, Bitstamp, and BitHum, and a portion of Ripple-managed addresses. Within 2 days, those tokens were gone from circulation, either locked, burned, or redistributed across unidentified wallets. What makes this movement unusual is timing. This wasn't just random whale activity. It happened at a moment when Ripple's global operations were expanding and regulatory clarity had just begun settling in after months of uncertainty. And that's why analysts are paying attention. You don't move billions of tokens without reason, especially not in an environment where supply, liquidity, and transparency matter more than ever. So what could explain this? There are a few possible scenarios, and each tells a very different story about where XRP is heading. Scenario 1, a strategic supply consolidation. Ripple has been known to move large amounts of XRP between wallets as part of its ongoing liquidity management strategy. These tokens often move temporarily out of circulation as they're allocated toward specific institutional corridors or escrow adjustments. In this scenario, the 2 billion XRP didn't vanish. It was repositioned to prepare for larger scale institutional settlements that are coming online in early 2025. Think of it like an airline redistributing fuel before a long flight. The reserves aren't gone, they're just being redirected for maximum efficiency. But then there's scenario 2, a prelude to a supply shock. Blockchain data shows that a portion of the movement involved tokens being sent to inactive or burn-designated addresses. If confirmed, that means those XRP tokens are permanently removed from supply. And when you remove billions of units from a fixed supply asset, you don't just change the numbers, you change the math. Less circulating supply means higher scarcity, and scarcity, in economics, always pressures value upward when demand holds steady or grows. This would align perfectly with the quiet revaluation process that many believe Ripple and its partners are preparing for. A supply trim today could make XRP's liquidity ratios far more efficient when utility transactions ramp up later this year. And then there's scenario 3. And this one has analysts divided. Some believe the 2 billion XRP were moved as part of an off-ledger institutional test. Ripple has been known to collaborate with global payment providers and central banks using both testnet and private ledgers that mirror the main XRP ledger. If tokens were temporarily locked or mirrored on a sidechain environment, that could explain the disappearance without any reduction in total supply. In other words, the tokens didn't vanish. They went off-grid for testing. That aligns with rumors from early 2025, suggesting Ripple is running large-scale simulations for cross-border settlements with at least 2 major central banks in Asia. Now, whether or not that's confirmed, it adds an intriguing layer of context to the timing of this movement. Because these tokens moved just days after Ripple's chief technology officer, David Schwartz, posted cryptic messages about ledger optimizations and interoperability expansions. For those who follow Schwartz, that kind of language usually means something is about to shift, not publicly, but technically. And that's what has long-term XRP holders excited. Because if Ripple is optimizing its liquidity systems, that means activation is near. The point isn't whether those 2 billion tokens were burned, locked, or tested. The point is why they moved, and why Ripple is staying silent about it. Historically, Ripple only moves supply when there's a strategic need. We saw it before the launch of on-demand liquidity corridors in 2019. We saw it again before key partnership announcements with major institutions like Tranglo and SBI Remit. When volume moves, it's because something behind the scenes is shifting. So, what could Ripple be preparing for now? Let's zoom out. The global financial system is entering a critical stage. ISO 20022 messaging standards are now live across major clearinghouses. Central banks are running advanced pilots for digital currency interoperability. And institutions are finally admitting that they need bridge assets to move liquidity efficiently between systems. Ripple is already in that conversation. They're not pitching ideas anymore. They're executing integrations. Which brings us back to this mysterious XRP movement. Because if Ripple is preparing for a liquidity upgrade, then the vanished tokens might actually be earmarked for a transition into the next phase of settlement infrastructure, a phase where XRP is directly linked to wholesale CBDC operations. That would explain everything: the timing, the volume, and the silence. But there's another side to this story: the investor psychology. When the retail market hears that billions of tokens vanished, the instinct is fear. But history tells a different story. Every major transformation in XRP's past was preceded by fear-based misinterpretation. When Ripple locked 55 billion XRP in escrow in 2017, headlines said, "Ripple restricts liquidity." But that decision was the foundation of long-term stability. It guaranteed predictable supply and built confidence for institutional partners. What looked like a limitation was actually strategic preparation. The same could be happening now. By tightening supply, Ripple may be setting the stage for a more efficient, utility-driven market, one where XRP's value is no longer based on speculation, but on necessity. Because the truth is, XRP's price will not rise because retail traders want it to. It will rise when the system needs it to. And that's where this movement could be pointing. Think about what happens when 2 billion tokens are no longer circulating. The entire liquidity model shifts. Institutional corridors that settle cross-border payments through XRP become more reliant on the remaining supply. And that, over time, forces the price per unit higher to accommodate global volume. This isn't a theory, it's a mathematical inevitability when a fixed supply system faces expanding utility. If you've been following the institutional adoption curve, you know Ripple's partnerships have reached unprecedented scale. They've expanded into Africa, South America, and Europe. They're integrating with central banks, payment networks, and tokenization frameworks. Every one of those connections will soon need XRP for real-world liquidity. And that's why a supply adjustment now makes perfect sense. Ripple isn't reacting to markets. They're preparing markets for what's coming. Whether you call it a repricing, a supply trim, or an institutional upgrade, the meaning is the same. The system is shifting gears. The disappearance of 2 billion XRP is just a symptom of that transition. For long-term holders, this is not the time to panic. It's the time to understand. Because the institutions who will use XRP for settlements aren't watching price action. They're watching infrastructure readiness, and that readiness is now closer than ever. Now here's where things get really interesting. While retail traders debated on X and Telegram about whether Ripple had secretly burned supply or institutions were hoarding tokens, a handful of on-chain analysts began connecting dots that most people missed entirely. When they traced the destination addresses of the vanished XRP, a pattern appeared. The majority of those wallets linked indirectly to a cluster associated with Ripple's enterprise partners, specifically entities that operate within on-demand liquidity corridors in the Asia-Pacific region. In other words, the movement wasn't random at all. It looked coordinated. And that tells us this event wasn't a mistake or a hack. It was logistics. Liquidity logistics on a global scale. Think about what that means. 2 billion XRP being repositioned at once could signal that new corridors are about to activate, corridors that will require massive real-time settlement capability. The timing fits perfectly with Ripple's recent expansion into the Middle East, where multiple banks have confirmed live ODL pilots. If those corridors go live, they'll need substantial XRP reserves for liquidity routing. That's not conspiracy, that's preparation. Ripple's liquidity model is designed to be elastic. Supply moves where demand is expected before it appears on-chain as volume. That way, settlement remains instant even when global flows surge. So those tokens didn't vanish. They were staged for deployment. But here's what few understand. When large tranches of XRP are moved off exchanges and into custody or escrow for institutional use, they effectively exit the circulating market. Retail can't trade them. That creates a temporary contraction in available supply, the same mechanism that pushes price higher when demand spikes. It's the digital asset equivalent of a stock buyback. Same company, fewer shares floating. Over time, that math forces the price equilibrium upward. This is why calling it vanished is misleading. It's not disappearance, it's consolidation. Ripple has done this before. In 2019, 1.1 billion XRP shifted into long-term escrow right before new liquidity corridors launched. The result was tighter supply and greater stability once institutional volume arrived. The same playbook may be unfolding again, only on a much larger scale. 2 billion tokens suggests something major is coming. Could it be tied to CBDC integration? Possibly. Ripple recently confirmed work with over 20 central banks exploring digital currency infrastructure. Each of those projects requires secure, controlled liquidity pools. Moving billions of XRP off public exchanges into institutional custody could be Ripple's way of preparing for that migration. Think of it as provisioning, the same way an energy grid stores capacity before winter demand hits. You don't wait for usage to spike before you prepare. You anticipate it. And that's what this looks like. Anticipation. Still, the optics are powerful. When headlines shout that billions of tokens vanished, fear spreads fast. But sophisticated investors know that market cycles often shake out weak hands through misunderstanding, while some panic-sold large wallets quietly accumulated. On-chain flow data confirms buying activity from high balance addresses immediately after the transfer window closed. That's not coincidence. That's confidence. Institutions recognize that if Ripple is moving supply internally, it's for optimization, not liquidation. Remember, Ripple's business model depends on liquidity efficiency, not scarcity. They want XRP to move, not sit idle. But they also need predictability. The fewer tokens bouncing between exchanges, the less volatility the system experiences when real-world payments begin scaling. Every move toward stability is a step toward mass adoption. And that's exactly what's happening, quietly, methodically. Here's where the story turns from mystery to meaning, because the disappearance of 2 billion XRP doesn't just tell us where tokens went, it tells us where the narrative is heading. Ripple no longer needs to prove utility, it needs to prove scale. These transfers might be the early footprints of that scaling phase. Once these corridors open fully, the world will see liquidity in motion, transactions completing in seconds, costs dropping near zero, value moving across borders as easily as email. And when that becomes reality, the conversation around XRP's price will shift from if to how fast. But before that day comes, markets do what they always do. They test conviction. They generate confusion to separate believers from bandwagoners. You're seeing that test right now. The noise says vanished. The data says restructured. The choice is which story you believe. History favors the builders. Ripple is building faster than ever. They just secured new licenses in multiple jurisdictions, expanded their custody business through Mataco, and continue to integrate with major payment providers. None of that points to retreat. It points to readiness. The narrative may feel uncertain, but the fundamentals are aligning like clockwork. And here's something most overlook. Every major bull run begins in boredom, confusion, or fear. In 2018, XRP was declared dead. A year later, it powered record-breaking liquidity corridors. In 2022, regulatory lawsuits painted doom. 2 years later, Ripple stands legally validated while others still fight. The pattern repeats. Fear first, validation second, revaluation third. We're somewhere between validation and revaluation. The 2 billion XRP event is a breadcrumb leading toward that next phase. What comes after will catch the market off guard. Picture this. As institutional corridors expand, the system will need higher unit prices to facilitate larger value transfers with less friction. It's simple liquidity math. If a network processes trillions daily, each token must represent more value to handle throughput efficiently. That's not hype, that's necessity. When that necessity meets fixed supply, repricing is automatic. This is why understanding the mechanics matters more than headlines. While retail wonders, where did the tokens go? Institutions are asking, when do we go live? That's the difference between speculation and participation. If you're here early, you're already on the right side of that question. The biggest mistake you can make now is assuming nothing's happening because price is quiet. Quiet is exactly what it looks like before the reset. Everything meaningful in finance happens in silence first, then explodes all at once. 2 billion XRP disappearing isn't noise, it's the silence before activation. So ask yourself this, when the world finally realizes what Ripple's been building, will you still be watching, or will you already be positioned? Because one day soon, we'll look back on this headline, not as panic, but as proof. Proof that the system was shifting right under everyone's nose. By the time confirmation arrives, price will have already adjusted. That's how markets always work. The opportunity is in seeing before seeing becomes obvious. Right now, you're still early enough to understand what others ignore. The story of XRP has never been about luck. It's been about preparation. And this event, this so-called disappearance, is part of that preparation. The corridors are aligning, the liquidity is consolidating, and the infrastructure is maturing. The next chapter won't be about speculation, it'll be about necessity. Because when global settlement finally requires XRP, price won't need permission, it'll respond to math. Until then, remember, markets reward patience, and conviction is the rarest currency of all. This is Crypto Equation, reminding you that sometimes the biggest moves happen in plain sight. Stay informed, stay focused, and never mistake silence for stagnation. The ledger never lies, it only waits for the world to catch up. I'll see you in the next one.